Welcome to the discussion on Russia under Putin, expansion or consolidation. We are privileged to have two expert speakers on this subject. Professor Graham Gill from the Department of Government at Sydney University and Professor Goldsmith, also from the Department of Government at Sydney University. Our first speaker tonight will be Dr. Ben Goldsmith.
I'm Ben Goldsmith. I'm originally from the U.S., as you may guess from my accent. But I've been here in Australia since 2005, and I have a background in studying Russia and the former Soviet Union. But I was one of those folks who was caught sort of right in the middle of, in terms of career paths, of becoming a Sovietologist just about the time that the subject you're studying stopped existing. So there's a whole sort of generation of us in the U.S. who came through this U.S. system of, studying the Soviet Union, learning languages, culture, history, literature, and of course studying the politics of the Soviet Union. And then just about the time we were ready to go out on the job market, the entire thing collapsed, and we had to rethink. And so I've tried to use this in a way, sort of by chance. I've gained an expertise, or at least I'd like to think it's the beginning of an expertise in East Asian international relations. So my broad area of study is foreign policy and international relations. And so sort of the emphasis of what I'm going to talk about is not only what's going on in Russia and in Russia's relationship with the near abroad or the countries of the former Soviet Union, but also the implications for international relations generally, and the implications in particular for East Asia. And I've learned, even though 20 minutes seems like quite a long time to speak, I've learned that I actually have, I'm a bit too verbose, which is maybe why I became an academic. So I always start out by emphasizing my main points at the beginning in case I don't get to all of them at the end. So I have just a few main points that I really want to make. One is that the early part of the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was a new country, was one that I think was marked by a huge foreign policy mistake by the United States in particular, but one that nevertheless we now have to live with. And we can't simply say, well, it was a mistake, and therefore we should compensate for that mistake by being especially understanding towards Russia. And so what I'm talking about when I say a mistake was the expansion of NATO. So if you were a scholar of international relations or Russia and Eastern Europe in the United States in the mid to late 90s, when the U.S. was and Western European countries, NATO countries, were considering the expansion of NATO, there was a large, not consensus, but majority of scholars and academics and people outside of government who argued that NATO expansion was a big mistake for the simple reason that it would antagonize Russia and push Russia down the wrong path, and give the sort of the nationalist and anti-Western forces in Russian domestic politics more to work with in terms of rallying support and making the argument that the U.S. and the West were fundamentally opposed and fundamentally adversarial towards Russia, not welcoming. And so, I tended to agree with that. Of course, it wasn't universal, and of course the politics won out in the U.S. The politics for many reasons, including the views in the military, the interests of the NATO bureaucracy and other NATO states to some extent, but also the politics of particular ethnic interest groups like Polish Americans, Czech Americans, etc., who quite rightly from their historical perspective saw Russia as a great threat and an empire that couldn't really, behavior couldn't be changed, and so all these ethnic groups in the U.S. lobbied very strongly for NATO expansion, and that, at least in my view, and in the view of one of my PhD students, who if you're interested, I can tell you about his PhD thesis and promote his work in the Q&A session. These Eastern European groups really pushed towards NATO expansion. Again, I see I'm doing my thing of being very, very verbose. I thought I was going to outline the different points that I'm going into the argument. More beer. Okay, so NATO expansion as a mistake, and maybe I'll say a little bit more about that, pushing Russia sort of in the wrong direction. But another fundamental point that I want to make is that the implications for what Russia has been doing recently in recent months since February, or since March when it occupied and annexed Crimea, and in the following months when it's been really supporting and fomenting unrest in eastern Ukraine, are things. The implications of this go beyond, although the region itself is very important. The implications go well beyond the region and really set the tone, or set the norms and standards for, I would argue, for global politics going ahead decades, and in particular for the way the Chinese leadership will see the opportunities and constraints that it faces in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and in its territorial and other disputes with its neighbors. So I think I draw, I draw on these broader ideas of international politics and the global system when I think about how the United States in particular, but how European countries, allied countries like Australia and Japan should react to Russia's behavior now. So I see the potential for Russian expansion as great, but I see the signals that Western countries send towards Russia, regardless of the eventual outcome, as even more important. And in particular, the signal sent about how much the U.S. and Europe are willing to pay to prevent or raise the costs of Russian expansion or Russian intimidation of smaller countries is extremely important because of the implications for China. Okay, so let me go back a bit to say a bit more about NATO expansion and why I think this was a big mistake that now the U.S. and Europe own and need to live with. So in the early to mid 90s, the political situation in Russia was really one of great expectations, but also great risks and great fears about what the future held, and great opposition among particular interested groups to the potential changes that were happening in Russia. And the the standard phrase that was often used about NATO expansion in the debates in the U.S., where it's a bad idea whose time has come. And I think that's pretty much, exactly right. That the signal that was sent to Russia was that, well, even though there's lots of movement towards creating a genuine democratic system, creating a genuine market economy, opening up Russia, politically, but also culturally and socially to the rest of the world, and making a good faith effort to join the rest of Europe and re-identify Russia sort of as more of a European country than a unique or even Asian or Eurasian state. There was a real sense that there was a choice, and the simple fact of NATO expansion, regardless of all the other arguments that were made to the contrary by those in favor of NATO expansion, was genuinely perceived as directed against Russia and a move that was hostile. And this may seem, certainly in the U.S., it seemed a bit unreasonable in terms of the Russian reaction, but in terms of what we know from the history of international politics and the history of international relations, these basic perceptions of states about their fundamental interests and their fundamental historical lessons really are quite salient and really are very meaningful. And the Russians simply see NATO as a tool to encircle Russia or for the West to gang up on Russia. And symbolically, even if you don't believe, if you believe that, the U.S. and Germany and other NATO allies are not really out to attack Russia, nevertheless, politically, this can be used, and it has a lot of traction among Russian elites and the Russian population that NATO is a threat. The Russians had a different proposal that I think could have worked and could have been moderated, especially given the relative weakness of the Russian position. They proposed to use the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe as a broad security umbrella for Europe, and to allow Russia to play an important role, which it already did and already had since the mid-'70s in this organization. I think there could have been a real agreement around that. How am I doing on time?
Fine.
Okay. How much more time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, great. So this is by way of saying that Russian hostility towards the West and towards Europe is not without roots and not without foundation from the perspective of Russian elites and Russian interests. And this idea that's existed, since Soviet times, of Russia being encircled by a U.S.-led alliance or U.S.-led coalition, and this being a real challenge for Russian security is something that you have to take seriously, and is actually a serious concern among Russian foreign policymakers. So what's perceived as expansion, to get back to the sort of the theme for today, by many in the West, certainly by me and by many policymakers and leaders in Germany and the U.S. and other places, is we might think actually legitimately seen as trying to guarantee Russian security and interests in a way that is perceived in Russia as more legitimate than in the West, and the historical lessons that have been taken from NATO expansion and other events are quite different. So it's important in thinking about these situations to understand the Russian perspective and why annexing Crimea and fomenting unrest in Ukraine is seen as a maybe a reasonable strategy. And certainly the surprising thing for many people is just how popular these policies are in Russia itself, especially the annexation of Crimea. And I, having spent a lot of time in Russia and having just knowing a lot of people there and speaking languages, and also spending a lot of time in Ukraine as someone whose Russian language skills are a bit better than his Ukrainian language skills, coming to Crimea and being able to speak Russian with everyone there, who speaks Russian as opposed to struggling in Ukrainian, was quite a relief to me. And if you're a native Russian speaker, you could see how that's quite a relief to Russian speakers. So the domestic political traction and value of annexing Crimea is really something that can't be underestimated. Nevertheless, my main point that I really want to make is that regardless of how it might be legitimated, based on the history of international politics and world history since the end of World War II, and the norms that are really understood and accepted of international relations, basically that the borders should not be changed by force, which was the fundamental outcome of World War II and the creation of the United Nations and the UN Charter. Regardless of how much we understand Russian motivations and desires, this kind of behavior simply can't be allowed, and it's really no different in most ways than German annexation of the Sudetenlands in Czechoslovakia. And Russians get very angry with me when I say that, but the German speakers in the Sudetenlands had a strong case that they should be part of Germany. The outcome of World War II is that all of these disagreements need to be resolved in ways other than the use of force, and countries need to restrain themselves from using force. Big countries need to restrain themselves from using force against small countries to accomplish these things, no matter how much sense they make ethnically or politically, etc. So I think it's a really important moment, actually. I think it's a key moment in sort of the shaping of the international system that we're moving into, with China rising and becoming more and more powerful. And at some point, depending on Chinese military spending and economic growth, at some point China will be the most powerful country in the world by any measure, including the capabilities of its military. And that's the world we really need to worry about in terms of setting precedents and setting norms and thinking about how things are going to work. And the demonstration of strong cooperation on fundamental principles like territorial integrity, the inviolability of borders, and the illegitimacy of the use of force to take territory between the US and Europe, the developed democracies who are at least nominally allied and should be standing up for these principles and seem to have learned the lessons of World War II quite well. The demonstration of that resolve, to me, is the key thing that's going on here. So meeting this expansionist tendency, which may not be intended to go into eastern Ukraine, although it may be, and even if it's not intended to do so now, it may be the most plausible option for Putin in the future. So meeting this challenge with a strong deterrent message is really, really important to my mind, not only for the signal it sends to Russia, but the signal it sends to China, which is, as it gets more and more powerful, is very predictably coming into more and more direct confrontation with its neighbors over territories that it strongly sees as part of its national right and part of Chinese territory in the future. And so this is a key moment, and history tells us that these territorial conflicts are very likely to lead to war, and countries are simply not likely to give up their territory. Philippines, Japan, Vietnam, no matter how meaningless a pile of rocks in the ocean is, countries are just not likely to give up their territories without fighting and that fighting is likely to escalate, especially in territorial conflict. So I think this is a key moment and a difficult one for the U.S. and Europe, but I think they're actually doing not a bad job in sending a deterrent signal. So I'll leave it there.